Welcome to our Positive Links speaker series session, Turning Adversity into Advantage, Finding Your Competitive Edge, presented by the Center for Positive Organizations at the University of Michigan Stephen M. Ross School of Business. I am Julia Lee Cunningham, a faculty co-director at the Center for Positive Organizations and an associate professor of management and organizations. I have a few notes on the technology we are using today. During our event, attendees are view-only participants and cannot be seen or heard. We have turned off the raise hand function, but we invite you to use the chat feature during our talk today for comments and to chat with others. Use the Q&A feature to submit your questions as well as upvote those questions you would like to be answered at the end of the session, time permitting. We have enabled live transcription services for our event, and this feature can be turned off or turned on using the Zoom settings at the bottom of your screen. Lastly, while we're recording this event, we will not determine if the video will be posted on the CPO website until after the event concludes. The Center for Positive Organizations like to thank Sanger Leadership Center, Tauber Institute for Global Operations, Samuel Zell and Robert Rui Institute for Entrepreneurial Studies, and Diane and Paul Johns for their sponsorship support for the 2022 and 2023 Positive Links Speaker Series. We would also like to thank our series promotional partners, Ann Arbor Spark and the Managerial and Organizational Cognition Division of the Academy of Management. Okay, I am so excited to introduce our speaker today. Laura Huang is the best-selling author of her first book called Edge. Looks like this one, Turning Adversity into Advantage. She's currently an associate professor of business administration at the Harvard Business School, previously an assistant professor at the Wharton School, and is the creator and co-founder of Project Amplify, which is an initiative dedicated to addressing inequality and disadvantage through personal empowerment. Laura's award-winning research examines interpersonal relationships and implicit bias in entrepreneurship and in the workplace. And her work has been featured in the New York Times and the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, et cetera, et cetera. She was named one of the 40 best business school professors by Poets and Quants and to the Thinkers 50 Radar list as one of the leading management thinkers in the world. She's not only an incredible researcher who changed the conversation around investor gut feelings and biases, but she also is somebody who is very well known in our field as the best collaborator and best idea generator. And I know this because I heard from many people in various stages of academia speaking so highly of Laura's generosity and creativity in all of her projects. And I also had the privilege of getting to know her better when we both served as panelists for the Asian Americans in Business Academia Initiative. It was about May last year in the midst of rising anti-Asian sentiment. And I so admired how she showed up as such a compassionate and authentic human being. And as I was reading her book, I thought that my younger self would have benefited immensely from this book. And I do think any one of us who has experienced or currently experiencing disadvantage or biases could learn a lot from her work. So I'm really excited to share her with you today so we can focus on Laura as a person as well as Laura, the author, and we can draw out some of the core insights from her book. So welcome to Michigan, Laura.
Thank you so much. What a tremendous introduction. That was so nice, Julia. Such kind words. So it's really nice to be here with you today and to get to see you and catch up.
Same here, same here. You're very welcome. So let me start with my first question, Laura. I thought this book was such a brilliant combination of drawing from your life experiences and other people's life experiences, as well as your own brilliant research. I loved how this book was quite different from other business books that tend to focus and share stories from very famous, successful people. So could you tell us a bit more about what motivated you to, start writing this book and how it came into being?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're mentioning there about, I really didn't want this to be a business book in the traditional sense. There are a lot of business books that talk about these very well-known individuals, right? The people that we hear about in organizations, right? The Steve Jobs, the Elon Musks, the Jeff Bezoses of the world. And I do have some of those stories in there, right? So I have a story about Elon Musk, for example, but I really was trying hard to, I didn't want the book to be about people that I wanted them to be about everyday people that we would hear about, people that we could identify with, and not to say that these business leaders that we hear about don't have adversity, because they do, but I wanted it to be very much centered on the type of adversity that we would experience, or that we could identify with, or that we could resonate with, even in ordinary everyday people that we would come across, or that would remind us of ourselves. And so I tried very hard to make sure that there was examples of people from lots of different industries, lots of different walks of life, and so on and so forth. And a lot of it did become stories from people that I knew, or stories about myself and my family, to the extent where, when I was writing the book, I was just trying to get all of these ideas down. And when I was reading the final version of the book, after I had edited it and my publisher had gone through it, I was reading the final version, and I was like thinking to myself, oh my gosh, this story is still in there. Like, there was all of these really vulnerable stories that I had told about myself and my family, that I was, it was the first time I was really thinking from the perspective of, people are going to see this, people are going to be reading this. And so it was this moment of, oh my gosh, I can't believe this story is still in there. So all of those things were kind of going through my head when I was coming up with the examples. And I think that really speaks to your question around, like, why did I want to write this book in the first place? I had been doing research on these topics, on, how do we understand success? What does success mean? How do we gain an advantage or an edge, especially when there are risks and constraints and adversity, all sort of there that we're facing? How do we try and flip those things in our favor? These are things that I had been researching and thinking about for years and years and years. And I had always in the back of my mind had the idea that I wanted to write a book about it, but it was really when I was presenting my research, and I kept having people come up to me saying, like, wow, well, this is depressing. It's depressing that there are these disparities, and there's depressing that there's so much adversity. Like, what can we do about it? And I kept getting this question of, like, what can we do about it? And so it was wanting to write a really practical guide to, how do we think about this? How do we employ a framework for thinking about the adversity that we would be going through in our lives, and really making it something concrete with practical tips and tactics and strategies for approaching this in our own unique ways, in our lives, both in the workplace as well as in our personal lives.
Yeah, thank you. I can sort of see all the stories that you shared. The vulnerable moments are what made your book so special. So I so appreciated that it stayed on in the actual publication. So earlier I mentioned that my younger self could have benefited a lot from your book. And as you know, I was born and raised in South Korea, and I came to the US as an international student in my early 20s. And because I didn't spend my youth here in the US, much of the disadvantage or biases that I had experienced early on had to do with more to do with my gender rather than my race or my language barriers, et cetera, et cetera. So those are the things that came much later in my life, after I moved to the United States. So in my early 20s, I felt increasingly dismayed by all these unsolicited advice I was getting from other people, such as you shouldn't study international security because you don't have military background, so go study something that is more fitting, meaning more feminine, right? And I came to the US naively believing that getting more advanced degrees and credentials in the United States, which I knew to be the land of opportunity and meritocracy, right? I believe that would quiet all this unsolicited advice, only to realize that that was just a beginning. And so I have been incredibly lucky to learn 3 degrees from Harvard University, and yet people still questioned and told me that you just don't seem to be the type who would do well in a business school. And clearly, this kind of advice didn't really stop me from there, and I ended up still pursuing a career in the business school. But I felt that this tension of what society and other people expect me to be and what I want to be, like this tension has always been there. So I know there's a lot to unpack here. So first of all, what are your thoughts on this belief that we have on
Yeah.
hard work and meritocracy and how that will get you to the success that you would like to achieve? And what do you mean by hard work plus?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think there's so much that you're saying there that is so interesting. And I'm hearing like sort of two big things. The first is this nature of like, what I say often is everyone has something, right? Everyone has something. So we hear about sort of the typical cast of characters, things like gender, race, ethnicity, class, religion, sexual orientation, disability. We hear about these types of things. And sometimes it's a combination of these things. Sometimes it's one of these things that's much more salient than the other. Sometimes it's because of intersectionality. Everyone has something. So it doesn't matter who you are, you can be what is considered like the epitome of privilege, right? A white cis male, and still there are perceptions that are being bestowed upon you all the time, right? For one of the people I interviewed for the book was Ronan Farrow. He actually didn't make it into the book; it got cut out. So he was one of the famous people who got cut out of the book. But when I was talking with Ronan Farrow, he said something really interesting. He said that every time he walks into a room, people are making attributions about him, right? And things like, oh, you don't even deserve your Pulitzer. You only got it because of who you are and who you know. You're the son of Mia Farrow. You only got access because of certain things. And so like everyone has that's just one example of how, there are these perceptions all the time. And that sort of leads to the second thing that I sort of heard you saying, which was around hard work and meritocracy. And we often hear about things, we often hear about this notion of a meritocracy. And what's interesting about that is that what we discover is that to some extent there is this myth of meritocracy, that even though hard work is critical, and I would never say that hard work is not critical, but you could take two people and they work equally as hard, and one will be more successful than the other. And so you ask, why is that? Why is it that, you can take two people who work equally as hard and one will be more successful than the other? And it is because of these perceptions and these attributions and signals and cues and these other things that dictate who will be successful or not. And what I find in some of my research that led up to this book was that there are lots of things that we are doing to try and create a more meritocratic world. So we acknowledge that there are things like our hiring practices, right? When we're deciding who to hire, that perhaps the hiring practices are somewhat skewed. And so we need to have checklists when we're hiring or ask certain types of questions. or what we're seeing nowadays, even have algorithms or AI that are helping us and assisting us with hiring. Or we hear about things like the leaky pipeline, right? Where and so we see efforts being made to make organizations more inclusive, where we're trying to get more women and people of color, for example, into positions of power, trying to get them into management positions, leadership positions, and so on and so forth. Now, these are all steps in the right direction, right? I would never say that they're not things that we should be doing, because we should be doing these things. However, what I find that's so fascinating is that all of these kind of structural fixes that we're trying to put in, right? Trying to put more people into positions of power, or trying to have more equitable hiring practices, that individuals within organizations are actually more frustrated when they see these things happen. So why would that be, right? Why would that be when all of these things are things that are in the right direction? Well, what I find in my research is that it's not that they don't think that these are things that are going to create a more meritocratic world, but it's as if people are telling them, just wait. We know that there is a myth of meritocracy, but just wait as we try and fix things from the outside in, right? Trying to fix things structurally. And people are feeling very frustrated because they don't feel like there's things that they can be doing from the inside out. They don't feel personally empowered, right? It's as if they're being told, just wait as we get more people, just wait as we fix the hiring practices. And people are sort of feeling like, well, what am I supposed to be doing as I'm waiting for these things to get fixed? And so part of what I write about in this book is around how we can personally empower ourselves from the inside out, so that we don't feel frustrated and feeling like we have to just wait for these structural outside in solutions. And so that's the hard work plus piece that you mentioned, is that the hard work is there, right? Hard work is critical. It's one of the 4 components of this framework that I've outlined in the book, which I'll talk about in a second, or I'm sure we'll discuss, where the E, D, G, and E of EDGE, how to gain an edge, each stand for a component of it. And just to kind of give a preview, the final E is about effort and hard work, which means that hard work is critical, but hard work plus means that there are lots of things that we can be doing to make our hard work actually be working harder for us. There are things that we can be doing from the inside out that make it much more productive and make us feel much more empowered, and help us along in this journey to gaining an edge, even when the odds might be stacked against us.
Yeah, I really like that about your book, and that you give the agency back to the individuals so that we can do something about it, instead of just waiting around until the system corrects itself, which who knows how long it's going to take, right? So, so thank you for that. I've also always been fascinated by your research on biases, and in chapter 10, you write about your research on the biases that we may hold about people with foreign accents, for instance. So can you tell us a little bit more about this research, and what can people do about that when they're not a native speaker? And what do you personally do to, I know you're a native speaker, but what do you personally do in other situations like this to preempt other people's potential biases and stereotypes about you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that the accents is one of those types of perceptions that people are bestowing upon others. And I talk a little bit about my research on accents for a number of reasons. The first is that it really lends itself to how we can guide, how we can, that's the G of EDGE, how we can guide the perceptions of others, because a lot of times people don't have the right perceptions of us. And so we can actually guide them to who we authentically are. I started doing this research on accent, especially because I saw it I saw it in my life as well. So I'm the child of immigrants. So both my parents came to the United States. And when I was growing up, I saw that both my mother and my father were getting turned down for promotion after promotion after promotion. And I remember asking my father during one of these turned down promotions, because he got turned down for this promotion, and the person he ended up working for, his boss, the person who got promoted over him, my father was actually doing that person's job. And everyone in the organization sort of knew that my father was more qualified, but he did not get that position for some reason. So I remember asking him, I said, well, why is it that you think you didn't get this job? And he said, I don't know, it's probably because of my accent or the way I communicate or something like that. And so, much later when I became a researcher, it was one of the things that I was curious about. I was curious about, well, could the perception of someone's accent or how they communicate be enough to like systematically be, preventing them from getting promotions? What I found through a series of studies was yes. Not only was accent affecting the likelihood of someone getting promoted, but it was affecting the likelihood of them getting hired into top management teams. It was affecting the likelihood of them getting picked for certain projects that they wanted to be on. It was affecting the likelihood that they could get funding for their ventures. All sorts of workplace outcomes, overwhelmingly were based on accent. And so then it was the question of, well, why is this? And what can we do about this, right? Is there a way that we can actually, level the playing field here for people who have accents, for example, or what I defined as a non-standard American accent. And we looked at 40 different accents, right? Japanese, Russian, Korean, 40 different accents. What I found was that it actually wasn't about communication at all. Right? It wasn't about their ability to communicate. They were actually able to communicate their thoughts and get their ideas across just as well as native speakers, right? And very quickly, I tested this by, for example, I would take 4 accented individuals and 4 non-accented individuals, and I would randomize the order in which they would, for example, pitch to a panel of investors. So they would presumably entrepreneurs pitching their ideas. And I wouldn't ask the investors, who would you invest in? Because I already knew they were less likely to invest in those with accents. Instead, I just asked the investors to write down, 3 things that they learned from all of the pitches, or 3 things that they remember or recalled, and so on and so forth, and found that they were just as likely to have learned things and remembered things and be engaged with ideas from those who had accents as those who didn't. What I also discovered, though, was that there were underlying perceptions that were driving their likelihood to not invest. So that it just so happened that those people who had accents were rated lower on things like, how mentorable is this person? Or how likable is this person? Or how good of a, how creative and out of the box thinking is this person? These were all characteristics that we can agree are important. And it just so happens that those legitimate criteria were linked with those who had accents. So the underlying perception was that those who had accents were going to be less likable or less creative or less whatever it might be. And so what my team and I then just did was, okay, well, how can we, inoculate against this? How can we prevent this from happening? And so what we did was, to test this, we would take those accented individuals, and the next time they would go and pitch to an entrepreneur, an investor, I would say to them, the perception they have about you, person A, is that you're not as creative and out of the box thinking. The perception they have about you, person B, is that you're not as interpersonally influential and you can't make this sale, right? The person they have about you, person C, is that you're not as mentorable, right? And so that's all I told them. And then the next time they would go and pitch, what I heard was pretty phenomenal. I heard them giving examples. So they would get asked, like, tell me about a time when, or give me an example of, or they would get asked these questions. And I heard them saying things like, let me tell you about a time when I fought for resources for my team. Or let me tell you about a time when I closed this sale and I did it in a really creative and innovative way. Or let me tell you about a time when I took this piece of advice, and it really changed the way I thought about something, right? They were giving examples of times when they were creative or out of the box thinking or mentorable and so on and so forth. And what I found was that not only were they much more likely to get funding, that they were rated higher on things like creativity and out of the box thinking and interpersonal influence and likability. And here was the most astounding thing of all. They were rated significantly lower on how strong of an accent does this person have, and significantly higher on things like how good of a communicator is this person. Things that they had never talked about at all. They never talked about their communication skills. They never talked about their accent. But just by addressing these underlying perceptions, they were able to shift perceptions about how good of an entrepreneur they would be or how worthy they were of funding and so on and so forth. And so I talk a little bit about that research in terms of how we can guide perceptions in a really authentic way. This is not about being strategic, because these are examples of things you've really done, and understanding how they see those underlying perceptions that people have of you, and your accent, based on your accent or your gender or your race or your ethnicity or your class or your religion or whatever else those perceptions might be based on.
Yeah, that is such a fascinating finding. Again, like I wish I had known that way back when I had the thicker accent. So that is awesome. I really love that study, and how creative the design was when you conducted the research. Do you have any like personal examples that you could share on how you personally have used these preemptions to reduce the biases or address those biases head on?
Yeah, I mean, I think the key is really understanding those underlying perceptions that people have about you. Because we talk a lot about self-awareness, and self-awareness is very important, right? It's important to know your strengths and your weaknesses and your underestimated strengths and all of those things. But it's just as important for you to understand those underlying perceptions of how other people see the value you provide, or your strengths and your weaknesses. And so I think the first step is really understanding those, getting a sense for what those are. Because, for example, right, you and I are both Asian women professors, but yet the perceptions that people are going to have about us are going to be very, very different, right? So I also find in some of my research that the perceptions that people have are about 50 to 60% based on stereotypes, right? Stereotypes like we're both women, we're both Asian, we're both professors, based on those kind of attributes. And that's a lot, 50 to 60% based on those stereotypes. But there's a huge 40 to 50% that have nothing to do with those stereotypes. And so when you can disentangle and understand what is underlying that for you uniquely, that's part of where you can start to gain that unique edge, and how you can actually take distinct actions to that will help in again in your own unique way. So a quick example of this is, I remember when I was an assistant professor and I had just joined the Wharton School, that there's a male colleague of mine, a very senior colleague, who was very well-meaning, and he said, what's really important is that you come in and you network, right? We all hear this advice, like you should network. And he said, you should meet lots of people. You should meet all of the senior faculty. You should meet, the senior associate deans. You should get to know them, and you should network. And I was very kind of fresh had just joined. And so I said, oh, well, how do I do that? Right. I said, how do I actually do that? How do I network? And he said, it's so easy. You just get on their calendar and you go out to lunch with them, or you go out to dinner with them. And you don't have to have an agenda. You just get to know them. You don't have to have a reason for it. Just get on their calendar and get to know them. And so I said, okay, that's great. And so, I tried to get on the calendar of a couple of these individuals. And finally, a couple of weeks later, I got on someone's calendar, and we're sitting down at lunch, and this senior associate dean looks at me and he says, "So what do you want to talk about? What's on your agenda?" Okay. And I said to him, "Oh, well, the agenda, I just wanted to get to know you." And, and went disastrously. The lunch went disastrously because, here's this person thinking, well, you don't have an agenda. Like, what do you want to talk about? You got on my calendar. You must have something really important that you want to talk about. Like, you might want to, do you want to talk about the annual fund? Do you want to talk about the state of pedagogy in America these days? Like, what is it you want to talk about? And the lunch was such a disaster. And so I remember, like, after that, every time I would see him, I would sort of like duck and be like, oh no, like, let me try and avoid this person, because I was so mortified. But as luck would have it, a couple of weeks later after that, we were on an airplane together, and I sort of saw him, and I was like, oh no, we're on this plane together. And I was flying to a conference where I was giving a talk. And as we were getting off, getting off the plane, he sees me and he's like, oh, hey, are you going to this conference? And we were going to the same conference. And so he said, how are you getting there? And I said, oh, I don't know. And he said, well, I have a car waiting. Do you want to join me in my car? And I was like, oh no, okay, I'm kind of stuck. And so he and I rode together in his car from the airport to the conference hotel, which was for 45 minutes. And during that time, we didn't need to have an agenda, right? Because it was sort of serendipitous. And we had a chance. He asked about me and my interests, and got to know me, and I got to know him. And it was an amazing sort of conversation. And we really got to know each other. And to this day, he's someone where if I'm struggling with something or I need some advice, he's one of the people that I will pick up the phone and reach out to. And I tell this story because it demonstrates, it sort of brings to light, for me anyways, is that there's lots of different ways to do things. And for me, my style is not kind of networking and being able to hold a champagne glass and in a hors d'oeuvres and that sort of thing. But the serendipitous kind of opportunities are ones that are much more that bring to light, like, a little bit more who I am. And so, for example, if there's someone that I really want to get to know, I will, and I see that they're on a committee, I might volunteer for that committee as well and contribute. So that way they see me on a regular basis and hear my ideas and my opinions and get to know me. And so I find ways that I can organically do things that work in a way that really suit me. And so that's another thing that I talk a lot about, is like discovering those. And so I have a lot of ways that we can put ourselves through exercises and questions that we can ask ourselves so that we can discover what our style is, and that we can uniquely be able to navigate and guide and delight others in our own way.
Yeah, I think that really brings home this idea of how important it is to be aware of my strengths and the best version of myself, but also the awareness of others. Like, what do they see me when they first meet me, that kind of thing. So you have to be like very aware of
Absolutely.
both of those aspects of your social.
Absolutely. And it kind of highlights, that some people can just sort of go and say, hey, let's grab dinner and get to know each other. But I have to be aware of the fact that, because I was more junior, because I may be a woman, because of lots of other things, that if I'm going to get on the calendar of someone, there's a perception that they have of me and why I'm reaching out to them, versus someone else who might have different types of, who might look a different way, speak another way, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. That's wonderful example. Thank you for that. And one of the advice that you had for creating edge was presenting your trajectory and guiding other people to recognize you as a diamond in the rough. So can you tell us a little bit about what this actually looks like based on your experiences?
Absolutely. So the diamond analogy is one that I use because it's sort of like, the way I sort of explain it is, every single person, every individual is a unique solitary diamond, right? You're a diamond, right? Everyone, each of you, every individual is a diamond, and each diamond has different cuts and different angles from which it's going to shine, and different coloring and different flaws and different imperfections, right? Every single solitary diamond is going to be slightly different, and is going to have all of these different attributes. And so whenever you're meeting someone or you're interacting with someone, what you want to try to understand is, what's the angle of my diamond that's going to shine the brightest when they look at it, right? Because diamonds shine differently based on the lighting, the environmental condition, the people that are looking at it, the mix of people that you're with. And so understanding, because when you show that angle of your diamond that's going to shine the brightest, you're still the same diamond with the same imperfections and cuts and flaws and all of those things. But that's where you're going to have the deepest, richest interpersonal connection, where they're going to want to know much more about what is embedded within that, right? And so when I talk about sort of guiding, it comes from this, we already spoke a little bit about understanding the strengths and the weaknesses, as well as those underlying strengths and weaknesses that others are perceiving. That's all part of that first E, which is enrich. How do you, right? If EDGE is that acronym, the first E of EDGE is enrich. How do you enrich, right? Because when you're able to understand which situation, to which individuals do you provide value to? So there's all of these different aspects of enriching and understanding how you provide value. That's what allows you to really delight, which is the D, right? We all have unique ways in which we delight others. And so enriching is understanding how we provide value and understanding how others see our value, and also understanding that sometimes those doors are just closed to us. But when we're able to delight, that's the equivalent of cracking that door open a little bit so that we have the opportunity to show others how we enrich. And even that is to say, even when we enrich and delight, we need to continue to guide, which is the G, so that our effort and hard work can work harder, which is the E, the final E. And so all of that sort of goes together in this diamond analogy that I bring up multiple times in the book, in understanding how we can show and gain that edge.
Yeah, thank you. That was, I really like the diamond analogy throughout the book. I was also thinking that I was super fortunate to have people who take a chance on me, right? And I am very grateful for this. And this also means that people who hold more power should also be, noticing, recognizing, and supporting others who may be a diamond in the rough. So is there something that organizations can do to create a culture where this occurs more naturally, more frequently?
Yes, I mean, this is something that is not, we spoke a little bit about like, how do individuals empower themselves?
Mm-hmm.
But organizations, this is how do we make it so that the outside in is operating at the same time as the inside out? I think the organization, it's so critical for organizations to understand all of these sort of dynamics, because organizations are built on, there is no organization if there are not individuals. And so all of these individuals together as a collective is what makes the organization. That is what makes the culture of an organization. And culture is something that we often talk about, but we really don't always know how to define or even say like, oh, the culture of our organization is X, because culture by definition is very much like that, right? The minute you start to explain it, it doesn't quite, there's not really a way to explain it. And so culture is the things that you don't write down or that you can't verbalize, but everyone sort of knows or figures out, because there are these mechanisms that enforce that. And when you have a culture of allowing people to empower themselves and find their edge, what I find is that these organizations are much more productive, and people are taking chances. People are finding new creative ways to do things. They're experimenting and innovating in ways that really create benefit to the organization. And a lot of this is how do we create, that type of dynamic. And so I also talk about lots of different ways that organizations can do this. I'll give you one quick example. I'm hoping it's a quick example, because every time I describe, you probably know this as well, every time you describe research, it's never quite that quick and straightforward. But so there was some work I did on interactions, like workplace interactions, and one of the forms of interactions that exist in workplaces is through questions and answers, right? Having a culture where people are inquisitive, they ask questions and others will respond in turn, and vice versa. And so what I found is that they're based on perceptions and signals and cultures within organizations. There are typically two types of questions that get asked to individuals. And there's a wide body of research that looks at the difference between prevention and promotion focus, a regulatory focus. And so, but what we found was that based on who you are and what you look like, you are overwhelmingly in the workplace more likely to get asked one of these type of questions, either prevention focused questions or promotion focused questions. So I'll give you a couple of examples. So let's start with promotion. Promotion focused questions are ones that are like, tell me a little bit about yourself, or where do you see yourself in 3 to 5 years, right? So those are the broader types. But then, there can be things like customers might say, like, what other product lines are you going to expand to, or what other customer segments are you selling to, right? So it can be everything from the broad to the specific. Prevention focused questions are things like, what type of people do you feel least comfortable with? Or, what keeps you up at night? Mm-hmm. And then the more specific ones might be like, what's your break-even point? How many of these are manufactured in-house? Did you Turing test this, right? These types of questions. Now, promotion-focused questions are about the opportunity and how big you can take something. Whereas prevention-focused questions are about the risks and the constraints and the obstacles and the barriers behind something. And organizations typically engender one of the two types of questions, and based on who you are as an individual, you're more likely to get asked one of those types of questions. And the reason why this matters is because if you get asked prevention-focused questions, you're more likely to respond in turn with a prevention-oriented response. So imagine a customer is trying to decide whether or not to buy your product, but they're asking you questions like, how many units are you going to be able to produce? Versus, or what's your break-even point? Or are you manufacturing this, right? These types of questions versus a customer who asks things like, what other products are you going to have available in the future? Or where do you see the vision of this going in the future, right? The customer is much more likely to be a long-term fan of and devoted to the company that talks in a promotion-oriented way. So what do you do about this? Well, what I find is that you can actually flip things in your favor when you recognize that you're getting asked a prevention-focused question, that you answer the question, but you do so quickly, and then you flip it to a promotion-oriented response. So if someone says, wow, there are a lot of competitors in your industry, how are you ever going to compete? You do answer the question. You say, yes, there are a lot of competitors, including competitor X and Y and Z, but what our product or service is able to do is all of these things that allow us to expand and grow and so on and so forth. So back to your original question. Oh, and then I find all of these positive sort of benefits, that you're more likely to get the client or the customer or the supplier, and even more so, you actually gain an advantage over those who were only asked the promotion-focused question. Okay, so back to your original question, which is, what can organizations sort of do? Well, what I find is that organizations that recognize these sort of interactions are happening and encourage their employees or their customers or anyone they're engaging with to understand this dynamic are much more successful and build much stronger cultures. So for example, when they're hiring and they realize, oh, wow, this candidate is staying very much at the prevention level. They're talking about, the things that they've worked on and so on and so forth. But you just then ask them, like, that's really interesting. Where could you see that going in the next 3 to 5 years? Or the converse, if you see someone staying very much at the high level and talking about their vision and their goals, and you ask them, well, what are the things that, what couple steps, what steps would you take to actually see that become a reality, right? When you flip the different types of questions, that those people they're much more likely to make better hires. Those people are likely to stay longer in organizations, be more creative and innovative. They're much more likely to like you. Like, there's all of these positive benefits that end up boding very well for the culture, as well as the succession of that individual and that relationship being developed.
I love that example. And I actually have a story to share with you in that when I first interviewed for a postdoctoral fellow position here at Michigan, I was expecting to get the kind of questions that I got from other interviews I had, like, what are your skill sets? What can you prove here? Like, here, what are the, can you tell me more about your publications? But here at Michigan, I got questions like, oh, when do you feel like you are learning the most? How do you, when is a moment when you're thriving as a researcher the most? And so these were probably in line with more promotion focused questions, and
That's
that we're
right.
signaling we're investing in you as a scholar in the long term. So tell me about your future and not just about what you have done so far. And so I really loved it, and I ended up choosing Michigan for that reason. And then, so I really love that the questions that you ask to the new employees can really change the perception and make them better employees as well. So I love that.
That's
Thank
a
you.
great example, because it's such a great example, because it demonstrated to you the type of culture and what they really cared about. But it also, in answering those questions, right, you allowed yourself to process their questions and what they were able to offer, and you got a chance to really express yourself in a way that matched who you are and who they are. And so that's a prime example of what I meant when I said before, like, showing that angle of your diamond and being able to create that deeper, richer interpersonal connection, both with individuals as well as an organization. And those sorts of things happen when you understand all of these different components of how you enrich and delight and guide and so on and so forth to gain that edge. And now you're so super successful at Michigan. And so I think that's such a great example. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, of course. That was a good reminder of why I am here today. So, all right. So one more question for you. A big part of my job is guiding our students through their failures and rejections, right? So undergraduate students who don't get into the clubs and fraternities they want, the MBA students who don't get the internships and jobs they want, PhD student who gets harsh feedback from the reviewers, et cetera, et cetera. So I really appreciated this idea of aiming for 18 rejections that in the book. So can you tell me more about that, so that my students can also benefit from your wisdom, and what should be our attitude toward rejections?
Yeah. So there's a couple of things in there around failure and rejections that you mentioned there. So I'll start with the first, which is, sometimes things that seem like a blessing are a curse. And sometimes things that are a curse actually are a blessing, right? And we all sort of know this in the back of our minds, but it's hard to recall and bring that up at a moment where there is something that feels like a crushing rejection or a crushing like curse, something that is so devastating to us. And so, one of the things that I talk a lot about in the book, is this notion of like bitterness. And in fact, to the extent where my editor was like, wow, like your last chapter, and the last chapter of my book is my favorite chapter. So if anyone, if you're only going to read one chapter, just read the last chapter, because I talk about bitterness and anger and feeling sort of jaded, because we've all felt that emotion, and we've all felt that sort of sentiment. And my editor was like, wow, this is like, for a book that's supposed to be about empowerment and success, like this is a really negative theme that you're sort of ending with here. And because so to some extent it is realistic. And I talk about this, is it, when asking yourself this question, is it making me bitter or is it making me better? Right. And because we are all going to have those moments where there's always going to be drawdowns, there's always going to be these negative moments. And is it that it's this open wound that's going to continue to like prevent us from doing things or is it going to be this wound that has grown scar tissue and is now protective and that is now making us stronger, right? So is this making me bitter or is this making me better? And how do we get to that place where it's actually making us better? And so there's lots of sort of trite advice out there around like how failure is great and all that kind of stuff, but like it's hard to sort of see that when you're there and in the middle of it. And so when you mentioned the 18 rejections, that was something that I when I was first getting started, our field is very negative, right? We are doing research all the time, and the feedback we get is always trying to tell us where there's holes in our research, like where is it not airtight, where is it not good, by design, because we're trying to make conclusions and share our findings, and we need to, for example, have tested 40 different accents to show that when we're controlling for everything else, like education and all, right, we need to have all of these different variables in there to make sure that when we're saying having an accent leads to a lower likelihood of getting promoted or getting hired or whatever, that there's not all these alternatives, right? So it's very negative in the sense that you're always trying to find reasons why what you're saying is not right. And our journal, when we're publishing research articles, it's the same, right? It's this rejection. And so I sort of told myself that I had to get 18 rejections. So I kept a list of every single rejection that I was getting. And I said, I'm not going to make any conclusions, draw any conclusions until after I have gotten 18 rejections. But along the way, right, there was a couple of successes but I didn't write those down. I only wrote down the rejections, and you start to see patterns, right? And so you start to see patterns around like, wow, like every time I worked on a paper that was like this, it would get rejected. Or when I worked with co-authors that didn't match my style in terms of that, it would get rejected. And that's what essentially we are trying to do. And that is part of what gives us that edge as well, is understanding those schemas and those mental models and those patterns that are unique to us. That is also part of how we enrich ourselves and can go out there and do that. And so that was sort of the 18 rejections mechanism for me in how I was identifying those patterns.
Yeah, I love that. I think everyone should start counting their rejections and not giving up too early, because I'm pretty sure I have way more than 18 rejections.
Oh,
So
I do as well. I only kept track of the first 18 though. So at some
yeah.
point you do have to stop so that it doesn't make you bitter. So
That's right. That's right. I love that. So I also loved hearing about your daughter in your book and how you teach her to create her own edge. So given that we have many parents in the audience today, can you give us some parenting tips on how to raise children who have a personal edge?
yeah, so I'm not sure that I'm quite an expert on the parent raising part yet, but I still have a long ways to go. But I will say that, I think in terms of parenting, we love our children, right? And so we try and give them an advantage. And I see this all the time, right? We see parents who are, trying to help their kids with their homework, which is great. But we also see things like people hiring private tutors, private coaches, lots of extracurricular activities and all of these things. And what I often say is, we're trying so hard to give our kids an advantage. And yes, maybe they will get an advantage in one facet of their lives. Maybe they will get into a better college, or maybe they will get a better first job or whatever, but it's just one dimension. Instead of trying so hard to give our kids an advantage, why not teach our kids how to create their own edge in any sort of situation that they're going to be in, right? If we teach them how to create their own edge, we're teaching them that you change one variable and everything else sort of changes. And so they know how to dynamically be guiding. They know how to be delighting others, regardless of whether it's a boss or a partner or a customer or a supplier, and how that differs. They understand how to uniquely be, understanding different perceptions that people might have about them. And so that's why I think it's so important to not give them an advantage, but teach them how they can create their own edge. And that's what I try and do with my kids. That's what I do whenever I have people coming to me and saying, how do I get my kids into Harvard or Michigan or whatever? I say, don't try to get them into Harvard. Teach them how to give themselves an edge so that they can get into whatever school they want to be. And if it is Harvard, you've taught them how to get into, right, by really respecting and embracing who they are and where the ways in which they provide value.
I love that. I'm also looking at the Q&A questions that have been submitted so far. And so I'm going to ask those questions really quickly. So how does one learn about the unique misperceptions about us and our diverse identities? That was one question. The other question is, what are the sources of power we can use from inside out? And I also noticed that from your book, it's almost like a theme that these micro moves that you are describing in this book seem like a little bit risky, right? There's always an inherent risk. When you had this conversation with Elon Musk, that was also a little bit riskier, edgier, right? And so
yeah,
where is this coming from?
Yeah, so I think these are great questions. So these micro movements that you said are exactly what lead to. So, there is no, people say like, what are the 5 steps that I can take to find my edge, right? There's not like, the framework I present is much more of a perspective. And when you take that perspective, you start to do these micro movements that allow you to make them into macro level changes. So that's exactly what it sort of is, understanding these sort of things about you. And the reason why it's so effective is because it is risky yet completely benign. So what I mean by that is, when I talked about accents before and sort of flipping things, or the prevention questions and flipping it to a promotion questions, and sort of guiding and doing those things, like, you are really shifting people in these micro movements in a way that is very benign. Like, you're not saying to someone, I know it's because I have an accent that you think X, Y, and Z, or I know it's because I'm a woman that you think this, or and so on and so forth. Because when you do that, the reaction you're going to get is always going to be, oh, no, that's not what, even if it was, right? And so when you understand these underlying perceptions, all you're doing is you are addressing very positive things. And that's shifting these perceptions, right? You're talking about how you are someone who's really creative and out of the box thinking, or you're talking about how you've been interpersonally influential. You're talking about how you're giving examples of how you made the sale by doing something, or how you were a great mentor and listened to someone's advice. And so even if you're completely wrong about these underlying perceptions, that they don't think, oh, you're arrogant or whatever, or that you're not mentorable or that you're not creative, there's no harm, no foul, because all you've done was give them an example of some time then you are creative, and it's a real example. And so it allows you to be riskier. It allows you to do like what you said. For those of you who are not familiar, I opened the book with a story about how I had a meeting with Elon Musk and he kicked me out of his office. So before I had even said a word, he kicked me out of his office. And so you're doing all of these things in a way, and I was able to recover and, you know, have him offer me all sorts of like resources and everything. And so you're doing it in a way that's risky yet completely isn't risky, because you do have this perspective in mind that is very much you, and it is very much authentic to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was wonderful. I am so sad about having to close this conversation. So thank you, Laura, and to the audience for joining us today. And this book is filled with incredibly useful insights that could really help us reclaim our narrative. And I also highly recommend signing up for her monthly newsletter, which I did recently. Our next Positive Link session will be our 105th one. So it'll be an in-person event at Michigan. We will feature University of Michigan Scott Page. Scott's session, Creating Wide Crowds, How Positive Culture and Fair Process Can Prevent Madness, will take place at Michigan Ross in Robertson Auditorium on Monday, November 7th from 4 to 5 p.m. Eastern Time, with a brief reception following. So I hope you can join us, and thank you again for sharing your insights with our audience today, Laura. It was lovely to see you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.